Welcome to the 16th meeting of the House Common Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. The committee will meet today and I have 3:08 my time, which is 4:08 your time. And we will try to stay on time and hopefully get through this as quick as we can, such that we can have time to hear clearly from the witnesses and to be asked questions. We will hear witnesses as part of the committee study on the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic today. Just to inform the members, the committee will not meet on Wednesday, February 3rd. We expect that there will be a large number of votes following question period that day. We're understanding close to 5, which is going to add an extended amount of time. So with that said, we will prevent the committee from meeting during that afternoon. We tried to reschedule it, but we were unable to, and so we have rescheduled the planned witness for the next meeting of the committee on Wednesday, February 17th. To ensure an orderly meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Interpretation in this video conference will work very well like a regular committee meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen to either floor, English, or French. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. When you're ready to speak, you can click on the microphone icon to activate your mic. When you're not speaking, your mic should be on mute. For those people who are participating in the committee room, please note that masks are required unless seated and when physical distancing is not possible. My understanding is that each witness has an opening statement. You will each be given 5 minutes to speak, and we'll go in order that I have on the notice of the meeting. So with that said, I will invite Mr. Braun to deliver his opening statements. Mr. Braun, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to speak on this important issue, whistleblowing during the COVID pandemic. The group that I represent, along with Mr. Cutler and Mr. Holman, was made up of a range of Canadian experts in transparency and whistleblowing. We were brought together to seek solutions to a problem: how to detect and correct wrongdoing in both the public and private sectors during the COVID emergency. I've also been researching whistleblowing in Westminster governments for several years. At the start of the pandemic, there were numerous stories of shady deals for PPE equipment, not just in Canada, but all over the world. Later, I heard of employers failing to pass on the emergency wage supplement to their workers, with employees too afraid to speak up for fear of losing their jobs. In Ontario, Ashley Jenkins was fired for speaking up on conditions in a long-term care home. Nurses in Quebec complained of the similar reprisals. You may also recall that the Canadian Armed Forces sent in medical personnel to assist in long-term care homes in Ontario. The horrifying details of what they found were leaked to the media, revealing just how badly provincial oversight had failed. These cases represent only a tiny fraction of the employees who have observed wrongdoing. Research shows that only about half of employees will ever report serious wrongdoing, and that only about 10% ever disclose outside the organization, usually when internal disclosure has failed. Less than 1% of them will ever approach the media. This implies that hundreds of cases of COVID-related wrongdoing across Canada that we know nothing about and that may be ongoing. Transparency, as my colleague Mr. Holman will attest, is one part of the solution. Making whistleblowing safe is another. Study after study has confirmed that insider tips, whistleblowing, are the most effective way of detecting misconduct in organizations, beating out audit, management review, law enforcement, everything. But despite the value of the information they provide, whistleblowers in Canada are not adequately protected. Even internal whistleblowing is punished, partly to send a signal to other workers and partly to head off external whistleblowing to a regulator or to the public. Employers make reprisals because they can get away with it. The most comprehensive whistleblowing laws in Canada, which only cover the public sector, don't really work. I know this because my colleagues and I have been comparing them with best practices for years. Most private sector workers have no protection at all outside of common law, which is a difficult and expensive route to take. Few laws exist in different sectors, but they're disconnected, ineffective, or just unused. For this reason, Tom Devine, one of the world's foremost experts on whistleblowing, called Canadian whistleblowing law a tissue paper shield, meaning utterly useless and deceptive. In fact, as Mr. Drouin and Mr. McCauley may recall, he said so to OGGO almost 4 years ago as part of the review of the federal whistleblowing law. That review led to a unanimous report recommending changes. Unfortunately, none were adopted. This sets us apart from many other jurisdictions, such as the EU, which has just recently required all member countries to implement new and better whistleblowing laws. To try to address both the short and the long-term challenges, our group arrived at 3 recommendations related to whistleblowing. 1, the appointment of a COVID ombudsperson to receive disclosures and inquiries, to direct concerned Canadians to the right avenues and to help resolve disputes. 2, that an awareness campaign be launched to inform Canadians of their rights to speak up and the disclosure avenues available to them. And 3, that existing whistleblowing laws be rewritten to meet best practices and expanded to include both the public and private sectors. In closing, nobody is served by the current state of affairs, not whistleblowers, not the public, not organizations or the government. The key point is that protecting whistleblowers ensures that wrongdoing can't be swept under the carpet. As the long-term care tragedy painfully illustrates, unchecked problems metastasize and can cost lives. Effective whistleblowing systems allow problems to be identified, competently investigated, and more quickly corrected. Accordingly, we ask this committee to recommend immediate action to advise and protect whistleblowers now and in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Braun. I appreciate that. Mr. Cutler, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. As you've heard from Mr. Braun, I'm going to be saying some of the same things. I'm going to say some of them a little different and more general. We all know we're in the middle of a pandemic and there's no precedent that's been followed. So we all know mistakes have and will happen. But what do we do about them? Everyone has an opinion what should be done. Criticism's easy from hindsight, but people involved in it are trapped, especially when people won't confess to mistakes. Whistleblowers, I talk to quite a few, just as Mr. Braun does, and maybe I'm talking to them more actively right now. There's 2 issues that come up continually. One is the fear factor. What's going to happen to them if they speak out? And right now, they're afraid, in addition, of losing their jobs. Jobs have been lost around the country. We have less workforce than we used to. And they're going, well, if I speak up, I'll be the next one to go. So they don't want to. And the other one they're really worried about, equally, is retaliation. And along with that comes the issue of trust. Right now, I don't know of a whistleblower who trusts any public official of any party. They're scared. The public has lost the ability to have the public trust them. So the laws, as Mr. Braun said, are weak to non-existent. The federal law is not really very good at all. And in particular, I'm going to make a point that none of the laws, to our knowledge, has the reverse onus that's critical in good whistleblowing legislation. And the reverse onus means that in the sense of retaliation, the employer has to prove they did not retaliate rather than the whistleblower proving there is retaliation. Who has the power? Who have the documents? It's the employer, not the employee. So there's 3 fundamental ethical principles I'm going to mention, which have been brought up before, and they relate to procurement, but they also, which has happened vastly in here. The 3 fundamental principles are fairness, openness, and transparency. The federal ombudsman has addressed this and it's been brought to the committees before. And there's 4 reasons to sole source only. And I know I'm deviating from just the whistleblowing, but I'm getting into where the whistleblowing has had some effect and some things have happened. 4 reasons, one of which is urgency. Well, with the pandemic, the government is totally right. Provincials, federal, you're totally right that it's urgent. You don't have time to go through the normal procurement practices to get what you want. So the issues of fairness and openness exist with competition. And fairness and openness, fairness is equal treatment to all bidders. Well, competition has to be there to do that. And openness is providing everybody a chance to submit bids. The government's made some attempts to do that to the extent possible. But transparency never leaves. Transparency is providing information in a timely fashion, and it never changes. It never leaves, whether it's competitive, whether it's negotiated. It never leaves with HR, with any facet of our public life or our private life. We have to be able to get the information out and be protected getting it out. And right now, it's not happening. And ATIPs, which is another part of it, are not, well, ATIPs are a great way to park the information and delay giving you anything you want. I've had a lot of frustration in getting information, which should be freely given, and some of it's very simple. So, in conclusion, I'm going to be short and just say mistakes happen. We all know mistakes happen. Some governments have admitted this. The provincial government, Ontario, admitted they should have kept doing influenza. We should have kept doing shots for people during Christmas, and they stopped for 2 days. They admitted it was a mistake. There is absolutely nothing wrong with admitting a mistake. And the other thing is when details are essential. When are we going to find details? What we seem to hear from many people is sometime in the future. And that's the over the rainbow type of defense. You know, it will be okay. Yes, we all know one day in the future it will be okay. The last report I could see done by an independent organization said we will actually be out of the pandemic in 2022, about the summer. That's not acceptable. We should have definite information that's going on. And the whistleblowers will talk to me, but they won't talk to anybody else because they're scared of talking out. And they also don't trust the media anymore. So on that note, I'll leave it, which is the same, essentially the same as where Mr. Braun left it. We need a national law that covers the private sector, the public sector, and the not-for-profit. We need one national, solid, good law for all whistleblowers for reporting all wrongdoing in this country. And with that note, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler. And now, Mr. Ullman, up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'd also like to thank the committee for once again inviting me to testify on how the public's right to know has been compromised during the pandemic and what can be done about that problem. I'm a journalism professor at Mount Royal University in Calgary, where my research focuses on why we value information in democracies and the history of our country's freedom of information laws. I am also, as Mr. Braun mentioned, a member of the Canadian COVID-19 Accountability Group, an ad hoc coalition of experts who joined together last year to recommend reforms to Canada's whistleblowing and freedom of information laws within the context of the pandemic. And that expertise is why I am deeply troubled by the scale of secrecy that we have seen from Canadian governments during the pandemic, which has only continued since I last testified before this committee. That secrecy has meant the federal government has failed to provide the public and public officials with the data needed to track and account for billions of dollars in COVID-19 spending, including the costs and contracts for COVID-19 vaccines. It's meant a failure to maintain the usability of Canada's already broken access to information system, and it's meant the government has too often refused or delayed answering basic questions from the news media and the opposition about its pandemic response, from when vaccines will arrive in this country to whether the Prime Minister has spoken to leader of one of the companies making those vaccines. But that secrecy didn't just start during the pandemic. History has shown it is an endemic part of our system of government, no matter who holds power in Ottawa. It's because this system is literally built around the notion that decisions must be made in private. Prime Minister said as much last month when he argued the need for accountability and openness must be balanced against the ability to grapple with very difficult questions in a fulsome way. And since many of the questions government deals with are difficult questions, the result is very little transparency, something that is reflected and reinforced by the fact that everything which happens in cabinet, government's principal decision-making body, is a secret. This belief in the necessity of private decision-making has penetrated every part of government, from the highest minister to the lowliest bureaucrat. But not only does this attitude infantilize the Canadian public and degrade our democracy, it also threatens the political and social stability of our country. People want information because they want control and certainty. They want information so they can make better decisions about the world around them, thereby controlling public and private institutions. And they want information so they can better understand the world, thereby feeling more certain about what's going to happen in it. During an emergency, such as the one we're living through right now, this need for information accelerates. That's because Canadians want to make the best possible decisions to keep themselves safe, while ensuring governments and corporations are doing the same thing on their behalf. And the costs of not providing this information are severe in the post-truth era. If there's an information gap, there's now a substantial risk it will be filled with misinformation and disinformation. And we can see that in the anti-masking protests that have happened across this country, and we can see it in the conspiracy theories those protests are based on. This is why it is imperative the federal government be more open with Canadians during this emergency. These times demand less secrecy, not more secrecy. And the truth is the only counter to the lies that have become such a pernicious part of the public sphere. To that end, the COVID-19 Accountability Group has recommended the government be legally required to proactively release a number of broad categories of unredacted records within 15 days of them being prepared, including health and safety inspection reports, public health research, and government contracts. There's no reason why Canadians should not have access to the truth in these records, whether we're in a pandemic or not. And in combination with the whistleblowing reforms recommended by my colleagues, we believe that these measures will do much to ensure Canadian confidence in the government and preserve evidence-based decision-making at a time when it's under threat, while hindering wrongdoing and abuse within the public sector. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Holman. Sorry, I apologize for pronouncing your name wrong.
It's quite all right.
So we will go into our first round of questions, and we will start with Mr. McCauley for 6 minutes.
Great, thanks, Mr. Chair. Gentlemen, welcome back. First of all, I want to thank Mr. Braun and Mr. Cutler for doing so much work with us on whistleblowers, and other committee members who was with us in 42, Mr. Drouin, and of course, Mr. McKinnon. And despite their best efforts, the government really, has dropped the ball and done nothing with moving forward on that legislation. I hopefully one day that we will, because I agree it serves no one when we're hiding information. Mr. Cutler, I want to start with you. What do you think it says about our country when Trump's America, of course it's changed order to Biden, but both Trump and the UK have released details on their COVID contracts where we're continuing to refuse to release that information?
There's no reason why that information shouldn't be made public quickly. As you know, I deal in procurement extensively, and I love to read contracts. I'm a person who likes the details, not just, oh, we have a contract. I can say we have a contract about anything, but unless they give me details about it, it can be meaningless. I could have a contract with Pfizer, for example, and it's going to be 2 years before anything's produced. But unless they give me the details, I have no knowledge, really. And generalities are trust us, please, rather than here's the facts.
Thanks. Mr. Braun,
Yes.
same question. Like, what do you think when what do you think it says about our country, our government, when other countries are openly posting their contracts for vaccines, and we're still hiding behind commercial sensitivities, or it's a competitive world, which we hear a lot?
Yeah, I would go back to Mr. Holman's comments about a longstanding culture of secrecy. I worked in government many years ago, and there was almost an attitude that people asking for information were acting a little out of line, out of place. I mean, what do they want this information for? It's partly a result of, I would say, our highly oppositional Westminster system, and it's partly a result of a bureaucratic culture. It doesn't reflect well. As Mr. Cutler said, there's no reason why these contracts can't be put out in the public, why much of this information can't be put out there. The problem is that this capability was never built before in the past, and that needs to change in the future.
Well, you bring up a point about the PPE. I recall over the summer we were meeting, we heard about contaminated PPE, or the purchase one type of PPE but the wrong type shipped. And last I heard, here it is 7-8 months later, we still haven't got our money back. They're still protecting the name of the supplier for commercial reasons. We heard in July, oh, we'll announce all the names of our PPE suppliers. We still don't have it. We brought up the point recently about New York Times reporting large amount of PPE was coming from companies in China that were using forced labor. And yet at the same time, our government refuses to release the information of where we're buying our PPE from in China. Can you, in what world does this make sense? We denounce forced labor, but at the same time, we won't come clean on where we're buying our PPE from, when odds on, favorite, some of it is coming from forced labor.
Well, to me, it suggests a little bit of, it's a bit strong to say it, but regulatory capture. We've heard this before, governments of all stripes arguing that they have to protect commercial interests, when in fact, government is the regulator. And you're supposed to hold companies to account when there are shortfalls or failings. There should be no protection for a company that's not fulfilling its contract and that's acting in a way that harms the public interest. It doesn't make sense to me.
No. Mr. Holman, thanks for your input and all the work you've done on ATIPs. Across the country right now, which provinces, who's doing it well, who's getting worse? I know federal government, we seem to be getting worse, but who's doing it better, and who across the globe in the free world is doing it better?
I don't think any province in Canada right now actually is doing it well when it comes to transparency, because all of these measures, whether or not they're whistleblowing or whether or not they're freedom of information, are essentially coming sort of from the same source. They're all relatively the same. So we encounter the same problems as we look at all of the jurisdictions across Canada. What we should be looking at is how other countries are doing this and how other countries are doing it better. A quick example, in New Zealand, which has been elevated internationally for their approach to dealing with the pandemic, one of the other sort of interesting things that doesn't get as much attention as it should is the fact that they make their cabinet records and publicly disclose their cabinet records proactively after 30 business days of final decisions being taken by cabinet. You know, other countries are more open than we are. And we really need to follow the lead of those countries in bringing more openness and more accountability to Canada. And if I could just add another thing, you mentioned China. That's a really interesting example. Toronto Star just did some really good investigative reporting that found that many companies in Canada are actually importing goods that have been manufactured with forced labor. What's interesting is that reporting was only possible because some of those records are available in the United States, those import-export records. We don't have access to those import records in Canada.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. I hate to cut you off, but we were in a time constraint, so perhaps you can add that answer at another time. Mr. McKinnon, you have 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank our witnesses for being with us this afternoon. Thank you for being with us virtually.
A little bit about just what, in fact, this government is disclosing and what public knows as a result of many of the disclosures that have occurred during this pandemic. Je parle.
Of course, I'm talking here as Parliamentary Secretary. Amongst our suppliers, we have the Translation Bureau that falls under us, and we receive so many requests for translation of documents that will be disclosed to the public.
We are currently experiencing at the Translation Bureau to do public disclosure of COVID and other related documents is an overwhelming one. It's perhaps never been seen before, and that is precisely because this government has agreed to disclose a number of COVID related documents and do extraordinary disclosures. I do recall, and all members will recall, my colleagues here, the first motion that we made to adjourn the House and adjourn into hybrid sittings was one that called upon the Auditor General to do special examinations of the government with respect to COVID-related decisions. The front page of the Globe and Mail today contains disclosures that would that are extraordinary and would never have been made outside of a pandemic-related circumstance. I think, Mr. Holman, you have noted the disclosures by the Canadian Armed Forces of conditions in long-term care homes, which, again, arguably are extraordinary and would not have been made outside of pandemic-related conditions. So my posit, and I would like the witnesses to react to this, is that this government has gone above and beyond with respect to disclosure in a pandemic situation. And I hear many of the arguments are those that surround things like acquisitions, procurement of sensitive nature. And I would only posit again to you before turning the floor and the mic over to all three of you, is that we are indeed in global competition for vaccines, vaccine supplies, personal protective equipment, and to disclose many of the terms. We obviously have disclosed an important number of terms of these contracts, but to disclose many other of these terms would have in fact posed the ethical dilemma of putting actual Canadian lives in danger. So I'll just have you react to that, and over to you, I guess, Mr. Chair. I don't know who to turn to first, but we'll go to Mr. Cutler, Mr. Holman, and then Mr. Braun.
Okay, well, thank you. I obviously disagree somewhat with your premise in terms of information being freely given. I have been dealing with access for many years now, and the last 2 or 3 years, well before the pandemic, the system has ground to almost a halt. I do agree that it is much, much worse since then because people are not working in their offices. There's delays in getting documents, and that is totally understandable. And it has to be, to at least to some extent, judged as being acceptable if you want, but it should not. The delay is unacceptable. The fact that there is a delay is acceptable. And as for the government contracts, I have been dealing with government contracts for many, many years. I know exactly what documents are open and what are not. And when asked for a copy of a contract, certain information is redacted that is considered trade confidential, and that usually includes the actual cost, which is normal. But a lot of information is not redacted, such as deliveries and who gets the contract. And that has always been considered open and easy to obtain through a request. So, Sean, Ian?
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Cutler. And I think we'll go to Mr. Braun if we can. Unfortunately, we only have about a minute left. So if you want to get both, you'll both have to be quick. So thank you, Mr. Braun.
I just want to say that for me, it's not so much an exercise in pointing blame at a particular instant. It's a situation that's evolved over many years, and the capacity wasn't built up beforehand, and it needs to be built up now. I'll turn over to Mr. Holman though to answer now.
Mr. Holman, 30 seconds.
And you point out, Mr. McKinnon, that the Canadian Army whistleblowing is an example of transparency. It isn't. That information only came out about long-term care homes because members of the Canadian Armed Forces went to the media. So as my colleague, Mr. Braun, has sort of pointed out, this situation is exasperating a lot of the structural problems that we have seen build up over years within both the whistleblowing and freedom of information systems.
Well, I would just point out that the armed forces were actual formal reports.
Thank you, Mr. Holman, and thank you, Mr. McKinnon. We'll go to Ms. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Braun, in a time of crisis, decisions must be made very quickly, and sometimes you have to turn on a dime. What consequences will the lack of government transparency regarding procurement contracts, what impact will that have on our capacity to rectify the situation, and what can be, in the end, what could be the result for taxpayers? Will they pay more?
Well, I think the answer, of course, is yes. You'll end up paying more. A lack of transparency allows mistakes or misconduct to slip through. The best way is to have upfront transparency so that problems can be spotted early. When that fails, you have to fall back on whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are kind of a tripwire to pick up wrongdoing. They work when other systems, it's supposed to work when other systems fail. As to how the costs would add up, if you have collaboration between conspiracies between contractors, for example, that might not be as easy to spot if you don't have appropriate transparency and you don't have somebody looking back at the records. I think though that Mr. Cutler might be a better person to answer the contracting question.
Okay. I agree totally that mistakes will happen, and big contracts with higher prices are negotiated when you're in a rush, and we all know that. But mistakes as to what you're buying, who you're buying it from, there's no way of knowing what's happening except an audit, years later? Just think about 2-3 years from now, this information will probably be known as to what went wrong, but the people who already received all the benefits from it have disappeared. It is not that hard to have a checks and balance, but it's systemic systems that have been put into place to protect people from learning the truth early. John?
No, I couldn't agree more. This is actually transparency about good government decision making. If there's more transparency, if government is aware that it is being watched, if government is aware that people are paying attention, then chances are its decisions will be better. That's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about democracy, but we're also talking about good government.
Merci beaucoup. Monsieur Holman, je vais rester.
Thank you. I'll stick with you, Mr. Holman. On June 9, 2020, the Minister for Procurement said that because of the instability of markets, some information regarding Canadian procurement could undermine the orders of the Canadian government and its negotiation position. In your opinion, we spoke about this cone of silence. The fact that decisions be made in secret, is the goal of that to ensure that people get better service, or is it to protect the secrecy of our international partners?
It's to protect secrecy. Small little historical footnote. When we were talking in the post-war period about making government records available after 30 years. There's discussion in cabinet about this. And one of the principal reasons why they didn't make it 25 years is that men in public office could still be in public office after 25 years. And there was a desire not to embarrass those individuals. We're really talking about embarrassment here more than anything else. We're not talking about good government. We're not talking about democracy. We're talking about, in a lot of cases, simply the desire to protect public officials from embarrassment.
D'accord.
I see.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Previously, I've heard people say that we must be careful with whistleblowing. It may be possible that when there's whistleblowing, it may be of someone who wants to take vengeance on a high official or on an employer. Do you believe that this happens frequently? And what is the probability that it happens? Must it lead the government to improve its system and its laws?
It doesn't happen very often. It's very rare. It's a straw man that's often erected to argue against whistleblowing. But if you look at the BC Health firings that occurred back in, I think it was 2012, that showed what happens when you don't have an effective system in place. What happens is you have a kangaroo court, people being dragged over the coals, and all for nothing. An effective whistleblowing system ensures that doesn't happen. If there's a malicious complaint or if somebody's just simply wrong, the system allows for an investigation to go in, identify the problem, and the inquiry is shut down.
Thank you, Mr. Braun, and I appreciate you. Maybe you heard my alarm go off there at that time, the signal the time. But that is not someone's phone, it's my clock going off. We'll now go to Mr. Green for 6 minutes.
I have to say that I'm remiss that the recommendations in the first go around in OGGO weren't adopted. I can only imagine if we had had systems and principles in place coming into COVID, the kind of waste and the kind of incidences for possible collusion or corruption could have been avoided. I want the opportunity to kind of draw out on the recommendations that have been put forward in the white paper, and I want to compare and contrast between your definition of open by default and the government's definition of open by default, which they so proudly place in all the mandate letters. So perhaps Mr. Holman, if you would like to start off with that question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great slogan, open by default, isn't it? But the fact of the matter is that open by default has often translated into open except for any material that falls within certain exemptions and exclusions. And as we know, the exemptions and exclusions in the Access to Information Act are quite large. And they have been large, and they have been a problem ever since the Access to Information Act became law. There was a reporter commenting immediately after that law was passed that the loopholes were so big you could fly the Goodyear blimp between them. So what we need to do is we need to establish a law that requires the proactive disclosure of certain broad categories of public records. Enough with giving government an opportunity to exclude certain things. They've proven that they can't be trusted with that. We need a law that actually forces disclosure and forces proactive disclosure of broad categories of information.
Well, I can share with you as a former city councilor, this would be one of the things that I would try to root out in procurement. And we had a heck of a time doing it, particularly as it related to lobbying, and I looked at it as a continuum. And so the contracts are often down the line of the initial engagement on continuum. And I know, I believe it was Mr. Braun who talked about upfront transparency and the idea that some of what we learn about in Canada actually comes from American disclosures. You referenced export records. I'm wondering if anybody would like to speak specifically to the extent to which American lobbying records have far outpaced Canada. And I give reference to some of the issues around S&C Lavalin and military contracts and things that Canadian lobbyists had to disclose in the States, but our systems just seem to completely miss.
I can speak to that. You're absolutely right. And the funny thing is that we actually got an Access to Information Act in the early 80s because there was actually a recognition that in the United States, more information was being made available, information that Canadians didn't have. In fact, one of the big moments was realization that Canadians could get access to information about meat inspection reports at their own meat inspection plants down in the United States, but couldn't get access to those same records in Canada. So we really, I think, need to revisit the amount of comparative information between ourselves and the United States, because it will expose just how secretive our governments in this country are, regardless of their political stripe.
I would tend to agree. There's a certain smugness that we like to do in terms of looking down our noses at America. I think that there's a bit of progressivism that happens there in terms of how we're actually treating this information. And when you look at the contracts, for instance, you wouldn't probably have known this, but this was a question that I brought up repeatedly to the minister responsible for procurement, asking them to post the contracts. My understanding being that it only benefits the seller and not the buyer to have secrecy in these disclosures. And so, again, we heard from Mr. Cutler the idea of on the vaccines, options versus actuals, right? And so if Mr. Cutler can just speak a little bit about the importance of having an open, government approach to the actual contracts in ways that it might be able to, help us come to a better process, because this isn't about vilifying government. This is about having good processes in place that shine the light in dark corners and make sure that government is actually doing what it says it's doing. So Mr. Cutler, if you'd like to talk about the importance of having details, seeing the devil in the details of our contract.
Yeah, Sean mentioned about the whole concept of openness by default. Okay, I would tend to state that the government for many years has been openness by exception, not by default. And our premise, or my premise, would be from a user's viewpoint, from a public viewpoint, openness by exception. You can only close it down occasionally. And these contracts, by the way, what I was talking about are the normal process that is already there. I'm not talking about something that's new. I want a copy of a contract. I make an access request. I get a copy of the contract. I have seen the contract for Phoenix, for example. It has been given to me by the media who was given it. So the only thing that was missing was certain redacted portions, but it was enough to tell me a lot of the problems. So every contract put out under the COVID situation could be published. We then would know who it was, how much money we're spending in total. We don't need the individual figures for a firm, but how much in total, the details of the contract, all that information is already what is normally given.
I'd love to see those numbers on Deloitte myself.
I know I'm
at the end of time, so
yeah, I'm not asking for anything new.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler and Mr. Green. We'll now go to our second round, and we'll start with 5 minutes with Mr. Paul Hughes.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being with us. It's very informative we've been talking about contracts. I have a list here that comes from the Government of Canada, Table 3, that talks about N95 masks. From 23 businesses, only 2 are identified. The rest are just, they're only giving company A, B, or C. And we're talking $91 million, $158 million, etc. Do you think it's normal that we don't even have at least the name of the business? Sometimes they say it's an issue of confidentiality during negotiations, but having the name shouldn't it be a normal thing, Mr. Cutler?
I will tell you, yes, it should be a normal thing. Under the urgency, it's totally understandable that the government made decisions as to who they were going to give it to. There should have been a process to vet them quickly. My understanding is some of them may not have been in the business at all, but I don't know the details, so I'm not going to get into,
Okay.
as I said, criticism in hindsight is good, but knowing the details and knowing the firms should be just standard practice. What you want should just be there.
C'est bien.
That's what I think. Do you believe that, as per your experience, by not giving the name of the business, does it open the door to collusion? Could there be collusion between different businesses? And since we can't see that, we wouldn't know.
There can be bid rigging. You can't know if you don't know who's bidding. And believe me, the media love to investigate these things. So bid rigging, you can pay more than you should, and it's not hard to police. By the way, it's not always recognized, but the government has the power to impose contracts under exceptional circumstances, and also make certain that all prices are audited, so they don't have to be gouged. But again, I don't know what was in the contract and how the contract was written.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Holman, last week we've learned that as part of the casino contract, that was a contract for vaccine development, in June, the NRC in the House of Commons committee showed that the contract was in place. The government was said that there was still an agreement, and then in August we learned that there wasn't an agreement, and now we've learned that it was in May that the agreement was terminated. Do you think that's normal that the government is hiding that kind of information?
I think it's normal, but it shouldn't be happening. I mean, the pandemic is exacerbating and illuminating all of the existing problems that we see in the transparency system in this country, whether it's whistleblowing or whether it's freedom of information. And we should have a right to that information. We should be able to know. And that's why, again, it's necessary to have a law that forces proactive disclosure of large categories of records, including these kind of records that you're referencing, because then we would know for sure.
Comme vous le mentionnez, la pandémie.
As you've mentioned, the pandemic is exacerbating everything. Do you think the pandemic is an excuse for the government to do whatever it wants because no one is looking over what's happening? Do you think that this shouldn't be the case?
Kind of government. But what I do know is that this should also be an opportunity for us to bring in more transparency measures because these problems are being highlighted, because they are being illuminated. It creates an opportunity for everyone in this room to sort of raise these issues with their constituents, raise these issues in Parliament, and really get some better transparency laws than the ones that we have had in the past.
Mr. Paulus, 30 seconds.
Is the act that Senator Carignan wants to put in place is what you need?
Perhaps. As I say, I think we need sort of a large disclosure of records in the law that forces that large disclosure, as well as some of the whistleblowing recommendations that the COVID-19 Accountability Group has made.
Thank you,
Merci.
Mr. Holman, and thank
Thank
you, Mr. Paul Hoos. We'll now go to Mr. Johari for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses once again. Let me start with Mr. Cutler. Mr. Cutler, what you indicated in your opening remark, as well as the responses to a number of questions that my colleague has raised, that you are interested very much in contracts. You like to see the detail. You've reviewed many of the government contracts, and I believe by that means that you're quite familiar with the standard contract that the government probably issues, and you also said that you understand some of them are shared and some of them are not shared. Let me start with the fundamental question. Do you believe that the government of Canada procurement contract is a complete and comprehensive set of building blocks that, if followed, it will protect us?
You said the word "if followed." Yes, the laws and the rules as written are good. They're probably sufficient. It does respect the need to do urgent situations like pandemics, floods, fires, and have to react quickly, and what you do and how you do different procurement practices during that. And I don't have a problem with that. You mentioned my procurement. My procurement background is I did 30 years in the federal public service. I know the process. I know the contracts. I look at them and I understand them very quickly. I also understand the documents that should be there, but unless I can see them, I don't know if they are there.
Perfect. Thank you. So let me ask a follow-up question. Thank you for your response. Let me ask for a follow-up question. What do you think, having that much of experience, are the risks associated with sharing some of the some or all the parts of contract? Do you believe there is any risk in any dimension associated with sharing any of these detail of the contract?
I can make it very simple. No, I don't think there's any risk in sharing the basic information in a contract. Everybody, that's the normal practice that's already
But you're not
done.
looking for a basic information. My apology to interrupt you. You're not looking for a basic information. You're suggesting that the detailed information. So can you help me understand what's the difference between the detail and the basic information?
The detailed information would be regarding how a firm, if they have a product, how exclusive to them, how they produced it. But the fact that they have the product, if I'm buying 1 million of that product, I should be able to know how much the government is paying for that product. So the basic contract gives you a ton of information. It's only proprietary information that is generally redacted. And that is not a large portion, especially not when you're buying a product.
Yeah. So, Mr. Cutler, you said that you don't believe there is any risk. So how would you explain the fact that as a result of some of our procurement, strategies, or some of the procurement that we had done regarding PPEs, when it became public, some of the products all of a sudden got redirected or rescheduled? So wouldn't you consider that a risk when some of that information is made available? We may lose the opportunity to be able to secure those, and that actually has an impact on the public safety and health of the Canadians.
Okay. I don't, if you're talking about something during a negotiation, which is pre-contracting, that's a different situation than when you have a contract with definite deliveries and definite everything in it. The danger we have is not whether we have the information. It's, as Sean and Ian have both pointed out, it's the transparency issue. When you cover up, it's like a dark room. Fungus and mushroom can grow. They don't grow in daylight. So you want to protect the things from wrongdoing. You have to be open and transparent.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I think I
15
got about
seconds,
10
Mr.
seconds.
Johari.
Yeah, I'll yield that to. I'll give my other colleagues the 15 second. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Johari. We'll go to Ms. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask a question to Mr. Braun. According to you, so the law was arrived in 2017, but in 2021 is a whistleblower more protected than in 2017?
You mean the whistleblowing law, the federal whistleblowing law in
Yep.
2000 from 2007?
Yeah.
Well, in theory, yes. I mean, there are statutory protections, but in actuality, no. There's just too many loopholes in the law. Most of the law is dedicated to directing whistleblowers through certain channels and making sure that they can only report certain things. One misstep, and it all goes wrong. As Mr. Cutler was saying, the system doesn't really have the trust of employees anymore. And that's just for the public sector. There's nothing for the private sector. In cases like this, where you have contracting with the private sector, you're going to see wrongdoing on both sides of the transaction. The current law doesn't even allow the integrity commissioner to go into the private sector to find out the truth.
Est-ce qu'on pourrait faire
How could we make sure that this law really protect whistleblowers and that they are not scared of losing their job or suffer consequences when they denounce an event?
Well, I would just direct the committee back to its own report from 2017. There were some excellent recommendations there. Now, having said that, some of the people who gave testimony suggested a complete rewrite of the law to best practices. There are countries out there like Ireland and Serbia who have excellent laws that cover both the public and the private sector. So there's two approaches. You could either go back to the drawing board, or you could start implementing some of the recommendations that OGGO itself made.
Merci.
Thank you. Mr. Cutler. Parliamentarians, the population, or even parliamentary secretaries were able to see numbers. According to you, is this a situation that happens in other countries?
In what respect do you mean?
Maybe answer that in writing afterwards, but if you want to clarify that question, Ms. Vignola, for him. Okay.
I don't think she heard.
Okay, I will get back to that. Mr. Green, you have 2.5 minutes.
Thank you very much. We heard from the testimony of Mr. Braun the concept of regulatory capture. It sounded more like corporate capture in that it's designed to protect the corporate and commercial interest. Mr. Braun, would you care to elaborate on ways in which, in your opinion, regulatory capture leads to this type of scenario?
Well, what I was referring to is a situation in which the regulator, for example, let's just say Transport Canada, that's where I worked many years ago, is too friendly to the industry, and they start sort of bypassing their own processes, perhaps not being too transparent enough, or coming to decisions that other people might question. There's a tendency to favor industry in a number of agencies in government. My own research has picked this up in places like Health Canada, Food Inspection Agency.
Do you have any examples for the benefit of the people who might be watching?
Well, of course, there's the case of Shiv Chopra, where he raised the issue of use of bovine growth hormone, and the decision-making process there had been pretty much designed to approve just about anything industry wanted. Transport Canada, you had records to do with derailments, for example, that weren't being put out. So the companies looked like they were doing a much better job than they actually were. And we found out, unfortunately, at Lac Mégantic, just how bad it was. These records are easily available in the States, as Mr. Holman was saying. Why they shouldn't be available here, it only serves to protect the company, not the public interest.
Sounds very much like corporate capture to me. And I'm wondering if you had any quick thoughts on one of the ways in which that could be immediately addressed, or at least directly addressed.
Well, definitely the transparency. There's all kinds of data out there that should just be available for people. And the other one is to empower whistleblowers, both in the agencies like Health Canada and in the companies being regulated, because that's what these systems are kind of built on these days. They've got something called safety management systems, which really relies on companies to bring forward their own errors. But if they're suppressing whistleblowers, that information never reaches the right people.
Thank you. My clock had me at 2:37, so I cut it short there for you, Mr. Kitchen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Green. I actually hadn't started the clock on you, so I was going to give you an extra.
In that
10
case,
seconds.
I have, no, I'm just kidding.
So with that said, we'll now move to Mr. Diot for 5 minutes.
Hello, and thanks to all three of you for being here. I was a journalist for 30 years myself, so we dealt in a lot of issues with public disclosure and FOIP acts and all of that. So I know intimately the headaches that can come with trying to get information from governments. And now being a member of Parliament, the headaches continue. So just off the top, I think that we can all agree that hindsight's 2020, and it's obvious that the federal government and provincial governments made some grave errors dealing with COVID. I mean, it wasn't so long when we were told that COVID wasn't a threat to Canada, masks aren't really effective, and stopping international travel won't be effective. So against that backdrop, and that's just been in a year, this is kind of a philosophical question, but how would better disclosure of public information ensure that these kind of grave missteps are avoided? And anybody can start who wants to jump in.
But what we know is that when organizations know they're being watched, they better behave themselves. And the other sort of interesting thing as well is that when more information is out there, it allows people outside government to help the government and say, you should maybe be looking at this, right? Maybe you got something wrong, right? It allows for better decision making also outside of government too. But I think the other thing that we should also be concerned about is just the amount of information available in general, not just secrecy, but the amount of information available. What we know is the government, in a lot of circumstances, isn't actually collecting as much information as it should, and we should be thinking about that too.
Mr. Holman or Mr. Braun?
I agree with what he's saying, that I don't really have a whole lot to add. It's very important that people be able to make decisions. And I think that in providing the information, you're in a sense crowdsourcing error detection. You're allowing people to pick up on problems. And that's what whistleblowers do too, is that they're embedded in the organizations. Nobody else is better positioned to spot the wrongdoing, and they can get that information to the people who can do something about it.
Mr. Holman.
I think you mean Mr. Cutler.
Mr. Cutler, yes. Do you have anything to add?
I'm in exactly the same situation. The more people who learn about information, the more chance you have to have input into it. Yes, mistakes will happen. Corrections will be faster, but the over and above mistakes, corruption and wrongdoing will be avoided because people will be watching because you're publishing the information that they can then learn things about. So let's not just focus on mistakes. It's a broader category that we need, and we need openness and transparency to address it.
Excellent. So right now, speaking of COVID, Canada is way behind getting people vaccinated. I know that we've heard from the government that there are lots of vaccinations coming. There's lots of the drugs coming. But when you look at the stats right now from the Oxford-based Our World in Data, Canada is now ranking 20th globally, well behind our allies like the US, United Kingdom, and even some of the middle income countries like Poland and Serbia. So how would better access to information and improved whistleblowing legislation solve this kind of grave problem? Anybody can start on that.
Okay, Sean, I'll just make a quick one. It won't solve the problem, but it may have prevented the problem, because the fact that we would know that there was a problem coming and we would have been in a position of needing to address it. It won't solve the problem right this minute. Sean?
Yeah, absolutely. It allows for public pressure to be brought to bear, whether that's by elected representatives, whether that's by civil society groups or individual citizens. Knowledge allows for action. Knowledge allows for decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Holman, and thank you, Mr. Diot. We'll now go for 5 minutes to Mr. Drouin.
Merci beaucoup, chers collègues.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues. I appreciate that we have witnesses who have the chance to testify again before this committee. My first question will be to Mr. Kotler, but I do invite our two other witnesses to also give us their opinion. And it's a question regarding the Act on whistleblowing and how this should apply to the private sector. I don't know if you had the chance to do a legal analysis. Does the Canadian government have the possibility to legislate the private sector when we know that employment standards, well, a lot of it actually is a purview of provinces. So I would like to know, can Canada legislate? Because you did say that we need a national act.
If Canada can legislate, I haven't gone through a legal situation, but it seems to me that many acts affecting Canadians are national acts. I mean, even paying income tax is a national act, though we may not want to. So the point being, you'd have to ask that yourself. I'm talking about a need. How that need is addressed, I'm not knowledgeable enough to tell you legally. Maybe Sean or Ian have done some research on that.
Well, Mr. Drouin, you're not wrong that there is a division between provincial and federal spheres of authority, of course. We probably need laws at all levels. It would be nice to have one at the national level that covers procurement and federally regulated businesses like railways and that kind of thing, because that's still a huge portion of the economy and the private sector. I think that once you have one good law in place, the other provinces will feel the pressure to also put in better laws, because what we had in the case of the Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act, which was passed in 2007, is that's exactly what happened. Each of the provinces copied what was done at the federal level. Unfortunately, because of this, all of the laws are ineffective.
Yeah, and just to add to that, the other thing we should also be taking a look at is greater disclosure by corporations. This was actually something that the federal government started to take a look at in 1978 through the Royal Commission on Corporate Concentration. And there were some very good recommendations from that Royal Commission that talked about the need for greater information disclosure, not just from government, but also from these corporations, which were getting much larger and larger. So I think it's sort of a two-pronged approach. We need more information from the government, but we also need more information from corporations.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. I was curious because I know that when certain parties were all contemplating on either raising the minimum wage, the federal government, it only applied to federally regulated. So I figured if we can only raise the minimum wage into federally regulated businesses, then obviously when you create other whistleblowing acts, and I just figured it may not apply, but I was curious to hear your opinion. The other question I have is, it has to do with culture and whether you've been advising organizations about how do you create a culture of openness within the system. And I'd be curious if you've spoken with, and I know Mr. Cutler, a lot of public servants continue to reach out to you. And how do you instill a culture of openness? And we can pass all the laws that we want, but we know that people break the law. And unfortunately, sometimes you got to go to court to make sure who is right. But even before we get to that point, have you been advising folks on how to create a culture of openness and making sure that when is something wrong, then obviously there can be that discussion with their superiors, unless it's criminal, obviously.
Okay, both Ian and I have been extensively involved with the whistleblowing community, and I have tried, and I'm certain Ian has tried to get into the organizations to talk about wanting to create it. I took the time about 4 or 5 years ago and wrote to every deputy minister that was in the federal system. I only heard back from 2 or 3, and all the letters said, no, we don't have a problem. So they didn't need to look at it any further. What happens is, and we deal with the whistleblowers, and we actually advise them to avoid, I do anyway now, I advise them to avoid the public routes that are usually there, other than report it if you have to. But we try and help them get the message out through brown envelopes or whatever other means are needed. But we have to do that. We also have to check that it's a valid and not just a malicious one. But there's so few malicious ones, it's not a hard thing to check. Ian, you must have comments on it.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler. Mr. Braun, if you have anything you think you could add, and it's a great question, if you do feel, if you could provide that for us in writing, just because of time constraints, appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Drouin. We will now go to the next round, and we'll go to Mr. McCauley with 6 minutes.
Great. Actually, Mr. Braun, you can comment now if you wish.
I think culture is
writing it.
I think culture is one of the hardest things to change, especially because the people who are controlling the culture are the ones at the top who've been there for decades. They've been socialized in the way of doing things. So I think getting leadership to buy in is absolutely essential. You have to have leadership that will not only talk the talk, but walk the walk and send a strong signal. I also am a firm believer of once you have the rules in place, you have to enforce them. I'm coming to believe that culture follows enforcement. It's a bit like seatbelts. There was a time when nobody wore seatbelts. It was against the law. Eventually, people conformed.
Well, let me follow up on that then. Like, how do we make our ATIP laws with more teeth? I know C-58, I think it was in the 42nd, under that we actually looked at in this committee, took us a step backwards. We've heard, for example, the D&D hiding items from ATIP that were involving Admiral Norman. We've heard the information commissioner, just put the current government over the rails about the RCMP not providing information in a timely fashion. What do we have to put in to actually bring in this change of culture that is followed, that's perhaps pushed by the regulations?
for me, the short answer is consequences. There has to be personal accountability. If an official is hiding information from the public, then something needs to, there need to be consequences for that official.
Yeah.
But
who's got the best laws out there? Like you mentioned, Ireland and Serbia. Do they actually have consequences built into their whistleblower and perhaps on ATIPs, or who's got the best ATIP laws out there that we could look at?
Well, I'm not an expert on ATIP laws, but I can tell you for whistleblowing laws, definitely there are consequences. And one of the consequences is that the company, if they're taking an action against a whistleblower, essentially has to continue paying that whistleblower's salary for as long as they want to. And so there's a financial cost for them there. And there's also, in some countries, there's a criminal sanction. Criminal sanctions are harder to prove because you have a higher standard of proof. So you might want to go with something like administrative monetary penalties or something like that.
Or perhaps ban them from getting government contracts, I guess, in Lavalin, and then do circuits around that. I want to follow up on that bit about companies. We heard when we were doing the whistleblowing or the whistleblower review that contractors have to be protected as well. We do not have that in Canada. We should. Who out there is protecting its employees and level down? So we'll send out a contract to a large company who subcontracts. How do we get the protection in for those companies that aren't covered by our current act?
Well, there isn't any jurisdiction in Canada that goes much farther than contractors who are actually working on the premises of government, basically. Everything else is not protected. You basically have to extend the law so that, and if there's wrongdoing that affects the public sector, that the integrity commissioner could follow it to the private sector. That's one issue. But then you also have to have a law that protects people in the private sector. And that's why we're advocating for something that covers both.
No, I think that's definitely necessary. Mr. Holman, I just want to switch over to you. We've seen a massive delay in our ATIPs in Canada. How much is it due to COVID being a valid reason? It's been a year now. I'm getting letters back saying it's 4 years to get simple emails from 5 people over a 1-month period. How much is that a valid excuse as COVID? How much is culture trying to withhold information from MPs or the public?
I mean, clearly the pandemic is affecting it in terms of the ability of the public service to actually access records and do their work easily. But we were seeing these kinds of delays even before the pandemic. So, I think it's a bit of both. But I think, again, it's sort of highlighting a structural issue that has existed for a very, very long time. And we do need to normalize greater openness in government, greater openness than we currently have.
It almost sounds like all 3 of you are suggesting when we're coming out of the COVID, the pandemic, building back better for information access. Perhaps my counterparts across the way should use that slogan, build back better, to include openness and transparency as well.
If I could just also include one other thing, you asked about what other measures can be done to encourage whistleblowing and openness. I would also take a look at the secrecy oaths that we have in the public service. If you start off employment by saying everything's confidential, you're not going to get much openness. And then I think I would also take a look at the growth of the public relations state. We have a whole mechanism of communications now that interferes with the ability of the public and interferes with the ability of journalists and interferes with the ability of opposition members to actually communicate with line bureaucrats. So I would be taking a look at dismantling that relations state and actually allowing line bureaucrats to once again communicate with the people who, quite frankly, are paying their salaries.
That's a great comment, because I remember a while ago a stream of 22 emails to send one tweet from environment. It's a great point. Sorry, Chair.
No, thank you, Mr. McCauley. Thank you, Mr. Holman. We now are going to go to Mr. Kazmierczuk. And Mr. Kazmierczuk, I like your background behind you. So I don't want to show my age, but I do like it. So you have the floor, Mr. Kazmierczuk.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll make sure to convey those kind words. The This is really just an open question, and again, I've really enjoyed this conversation that we're having here. I think some important questions have been raised and some important points of discussion. Transparency International is a leading organization that's tackling corruption, and last week they released the its Corruption Perceptions Index (CPI), which measures perceptions of public sector corruption in about 180 countries, and Canada placed 11th alongside the UK and Australia. Their transparencies, they have actually the best transparency score in the Americas. And just as an example, as a comparison, the United States came in at 25th. So there's always room to improve and no doubt to do better. But I just wanted to ask, and again, this is an open question, what underpins, we discussed today some of the shortcomings, but what underpins Canada's performance on this index?
Okay, maybe I'll go first. I'm a member of Transparency International, as it happens. And yes, you're right, we're now 11th. But what you didn't address is that that's a drop from where we were traditionally. We were traditionally for years in the top 10, and we have dropped out of the top 10 now. And a good part of what is not done in Transparency International is it's a perception index, and it doesn't, for whatever reason in Canada, we perceive white collar crime as misdemeanors. We really don't take the corruption seriously. And consequently, we're higher up on the index probably than we should be. And many people who are in Transparency International would tell you that, and they've told me that.
Yeah, I mean, we quite literally don't know what we don't know. And if people knew more about what was actually going on in government, maybe we would find that transparency rating is overrated. Again, to Mr. Cutler's point, it's perception, not actuality.
There's an organization called Global Integrity that years ago used to do its own assessments of a similar nature, and they didn't just look at perceptions. They looked at whether there were laws to cover certain acts of corruption and whether these laws were properly enforced. And Canada always did very well on having the laws and not so well on enforcing them.
Okay. So what are some other means, again, maybe this is a question for Mr. Cutler, what are some other means that governments can use to cultivate speak up culture? So we know, for example, that the Ontario Securities Commission uses compensation, for example, monetary rewards. Can you maybe talk about what other means can be used or governments can use to cultivate speak up culture?
Well, one of the things used down in the US is literally rewarding whistleblowers, which is the Security Exchange Commission. And one of the other two may want to talk on it a bit more, but it certainly has proven effective. In Canada, we passed a law that said if you reported anything to Canada Revenue, you could get up to 15%. And then they put the caveat into the law that said, but a person who has a criminal record can't get that 15%. So Mr. Braun and I are aware of a particular individual who has tons of knowledge, and he can't, and because he was convicted in the States, he can't get that percentage to expose the crime in Canada. So he's just, and he actually says if he crossed the border, they'd find a reason to arrest him. So that shows you his belief in how the Canadian justice system works. Mr. Brian Holman?
I would add that when you're talking about rewards, you're often talking about financial crimes. The amounts are very large, and they overcome the fact that a person who blows the whistle in those situations is basically going to be unemployable in that industry forever after that. But if you're talking about it in government, it's a little harder. You know, offering somebody a little bit of money to fix problems it might work in some circumstances. It wouldn't work in all. I think we have to more be thinking about how to remove the stigma of speaking up inside the public service.
Good point.
Yeah, there's a real problem where even to this day there's misconceptions about what whistleblower motives are. You know, what they're blowing the whistle about. You know, personal grievances and that sort of thing. And that has to come from the top. That has to if you treat the whistleblower as if they are somebody who's trying to help the organization instead of attacking it, I think you'd see a real sea change in the attitudes and in the culture as well.
Well, interesting, and I appreciate that. Just a question. I'm not sure if it was touched upon already in our discussions, but the concerns that you've highlighted and you've brought forward today, are they similar concerns with provincial governments? Are we seeing this across municipal, provincial, and federal governments, and in terms of the speak up culture, or in terms of the lack of protections?
Absolutely.
And very quickly, if you could, Mr. Braun.
Yes, absolutely. This I've been analyzing all the laws across this country. They're all essentially identical. The loopholes are the same, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but basically it's the same problem across the country.
Thank you, Mr. Braun. Thank you, Mr. Kazmierczuk. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Braun, you've talked about the fear of whistleblowers for denouncing an unacceptable situation. When I think about this fear that whistleblowers have and the important consequences that sometimes the consequences that these whistleblowers have to live with afterwards, these people feel intimidated or even harassed. The law for whistleblowing, should it be also part of harassment laws?
That's a tricky question. Harassment is usually treated as a personal level issue and is usually treated through different channels. Of course, if harassment is a typical response to whistleblowing. It's probably the most pernicious because it's really hard to prove that somebody is harassing somebody else and that it's related to the whistleblowing. Harassment is what would be considered a form of reprisal, and it should be treated differently than, I don't want to call it garden variety, but that's kind of what I'm getting at. Because the people who control the harassment procedures are often implicated in the wrongdoing where the harassment is being used as a reprisal. Does that make sense? Harassment is a standard reprisal technique. If you want a fair hearing on normal harassment, you can go through the normal processes to get it addressed. But if the harassment is a response to a whistleblowing, often the leadership in the organization will be implicated, and they're also controlling the harassment process, so they can derail it. It's a tricky problem. I get where you're going with it, but that would have to be handled very carefully.
OK. So, j'essayais de voir les pistes de solutions.
I was trying to find solutions for improving the Act on top of the recommendations for 2015. On November 4th, the president of the Treasury Board has said that the info base of the Government of Canada contains all detailed financial information on COVID. Mr. Holman, what do you think of what was said? Do you believe that all the information is there? And if not all of it is there, what should be in there?
The information is there. I certainly haven't had time to look at all of the information. But you know, what we know is that that's not the case. And this goes to my earlier point, there's a whole bunch of information out there that government doesn't just not release, but also fails to collect. what we've seen time and time again from the federal government and also provincial governments is that in a variety of areas, not just COVID, but also anything that government regulates and touches, that we simply are not collecting the amount of information that is necessary to make good decisions. And it has gotten to the point where we often rely, and I'm thinking about health information here related to the pandemic, we often rely on other organizations to provide that information to us because we just simply don't have the public servants who are doing that work, who are doing that collection work. So I think what has happened in Canada is we've kind of gotten lazy when it comes to collecting the information that's necessary for good decision making. And what we need to do as a country is revisit that data collection process and really put in place some measures that require not just the federal government, but all levels of government to collect better data than it does.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. For you three, maybe you have some information that we don't have. Are you aware of whistleblowing during the pandemic with regards to contracts or actions? These whistleblowers have they spoken up, and what were the consequences of speaking up?
On peut commencer avec
Several cases, but in a couple of the cases, they, after speaking, they didn't want to go public. They were too afraid that the consequences would be the loss of job, and in one case, that the entire firm that they were working for might have to shut down. Mr. Cutler probably has more.
Essentially the same. They do not want to speak out because of the consequences, and they see really heavy negative consequences, especially now when what happens if they lose their job. And a lot of them, let's be blunt, they have a family, they have young children, they have a mortgage, and it's a leap of a lot of courage to step forward when you're risking everything. And you could, I mean, your kids can't go to school to a university because you can't afford it because you got fired. So you've got a lot of things to think about, especially now. And it's not getting better. The culture, everybody says they believe in whistleblowing until it affects their organization, and then how do we shut them up?
Thank you, Mr. Cutler, and Ms. Vignola. We'll go to Mr. Green. 6 minutes.
Thank you. In the Canadian COVID-19 Accountability Group, in your white paper, has the federal government responded to any of your recommendations?
No.
You know, I'm looking back. I'm a new MP, and I'm looking back at the report that came out of this committee, strengthening the protection of public interest within the Public Service Disclosure Protection Act. Very fulsome document. I wonder, through you, Mr. Chair, to the members present, if they would care to comment on whether or not they view it might be within our committee's best interest to revisit our own committee's work and find an avenue perhaps to restate the recommendations coming out of this, if this would be a useful thing.
Sorry, are you asking for a response from the witnesses or from me?
No, it's from the witnesses. Like, I'm wondering if they're seeing value in the past reports that this committee has done that was passed and then completely shelved by this government. Like, I'm trying to not get as agitated because, Mr. Chair, I'll share with you that, you know, in my own approach to try to get information out of this government during COVID, you'll recall the many filibusters that we sat in this room. And while I respect my, political friends across the aisle in government, I respect their ability to maneuver. You know, I think that it's incumbent on us, particularly with this committee, given that we've gone around this issue before, that we look at reintroducing the findings of our past study and really call on this government to take the recommendations and, not just of the white paper, but of the work that we've already done in this committee. So maybe, Mr. Chair, maybe that is through you to our clerk. Are there any avenues within this committee to reintroduce the 2017 report on Public Servants Disclosure Protection Act?
Mr. Clerk,
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The committee does have the option of readopting the report from 2017 and putting it back into the House. It could ask at that point for a government response if it wants. Alternatively, the committee could start a new study, hear from new witnesses, bring forward the testimony in the report from the previous session, and create a new report as well. So
I
there
would
are.
suggest through you, Mr. Chair, that given the urgency that we have, that at the appropriate time, that we do move to resubmit this study as whole, because it, I think, draws on it, but more specifically, in future meetings, we look at the best practices for all the issues that have been brought up here in these testimonies today. Mr. Chair, through you and in my remaining time here, I'm wondering, what they would see as being the quickest, most efficient way to introduce the ombudsperson, and what exactly would that position be for the good and welfare of people tuning in that'd be able to provide kind of immediate oversight in COVID spending. We can throw it to Mr. Holman or Mr. Braun.
I was going to say, we go Mr. Holman first. And
yep.
I was actually going to say Ian probably would be better. Mr. Braun would probably be better.
Fair enough. Let's go to Mr. Braun. Mr. Braun, in your opinion, how can we, in adopting your recommendation for an ombudsman, what would that look like, and how would that affect the positive outcomes on a COVID response on a move forward?
Well, we looked at a couple of approaches. One was to take an existing office and expand its mandate to serve as sort of a nerve center. And the other was to create something afresh that would be a standalone. You'd pick somebody who had competence in the field and who would lead it. The ombudsperson that we envisioned was a bit of an interim step, because one of the problems that face whistleblowers across Canada, not just in the federal government but in the provinces, they don't know where to go, and that's why the Ontario Health Ombudsman has been bombarded with complaints that are outside his jurisdiction. So if you stood up an office like that, you'd find somebody who had experience in the field, and then you'd have to give them a staff, and then you'd also have to publicize its existence. The role of that ombudsperson or ombudsman would be to direct people in the right direction, to give them advice. Quite often also whistleblowers don't know what facts they need to support them. So you need personnel who are familiar with the concepts. And
in your opinion, would that, I mean, it seems to be the case that this is an obvious thing to do, although there may be some examples where this position has also been politicized. But would it also be your opinion that we would need the corresponding legislation to enforce recommendations? Because as we've seen even with our own committee, we provide findings that are just completely disregarded by government. So how would we have that accountability measure in place for an ombudsman to be able to pursue that? And I do recall ombudsman is a gender neutral term and not a gendered term, if I recall.
Well, you're absolutely right about the gender neutral term, but there's still some sensitivity about its use. Yeah, I'm skeptical about government's ability to pass laws that on a dime that would be immediately enforceable. It can be done, I think, and they certainly did it with the CERB and the employment supplements. And yes, it would have to have some teeth in it, I think, particularly in the longer term. But there's no reason why the office couldn't be stood up immediately just to provide guidance.
I like it. So in summary, if this government was committed to being open by default, it's your opinion that they most certainly could.
I believe so.
Thank you. We will now go to Mr. Paul Hughes for 5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you. Earlier, in one of my questions, I talked about a bill that would be tabled by Senator Carignan, and it would reinforce the 2007 Act. Since the beginning of this meeting, I can feel that there are a lot of problems of transparency right now. Corruption problems. It seems like a big word, but it's not that complicated to be corrupt. Mr. Cutler, you talked earlier about different ways of doing things while we wait for a different law, because mechanisms in government are not efficient. So what are other means that could be taken that could help those whistleblowers?
Well, this becomes a difficult one to answer, as I'm certain Mr. Braun and Mr. Holman can address too. How do you develop trust? And trust is the key core of a whistleblowing situation. And they're not going to come forward if they don't trust you. And they don't trust the present integrity commissioner. So there's a lack of trust, but there's a few individuals out there, such as Mr. Braun, Mr. Holman, myself, who they do trust because we keep things quiet and we've been dealing with them for years. So the only way I can see forward is getting somebody neutral with a reputation for being neutral into the center and then saying, there's where you go, which is what Mr. Braun, I think, was mentioning about setting up a separate organization. Maybe he has a better idea, but I don't perceive any other way to go if you want to get people to speak out.
Okay. Merci, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler. Mr. Braun, you said there were dozens of public servants that talked to you, but they did not want to be known. Can you give us a few examples of situations that were reported? Things that were said to you?
So it hasn't been dozens. It's been a few. One of the things that's been remarkable about this is how few people have actually spoken up. I'm not sure that the problem is entirely fair to blame the public service for the problems. I think in many cases the people are overtasked and are doing the best that they can. But where there is wrongdoing, people are much too afraid to go public, and in some cases the details of the case will give away where they're at and what they're talking about. So, for example, the example of the employment subsidy.
Okay. The parliamentary budget officer last week said there were problems getting information from the Department of Industry. Do you have an idea of what departments are more susceptible to having problems when it comes to dealing with COVID-19? Mr. Would you like to answer?
Better question for Mr. Holman, but
Holman.
Universally, most of the ministries, most of the departments in government do have these kind of problems. It's not necessarily exclusive to one department or another. And what we can see in the statistics when it comes to access to information in this country is all of them, without exception, are dealing with transparency problems and lack of transparency problems. And this is simply because, as my colleagues have said, because of the kind of culture of secrecy that has been built up in government, not just under this administration, but in every single administration in this country.
If I could add that the privacy commissioner used to give ratings, didn't they, Mr. Holman?
Yeah.
A, B, C's, and D's.
The information commissioner did. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we've seen, you know, you can check out InfoSource because it includes those statistics on a department by department basis. Some are worse than others. We see, for example, significant problems in immigration. The Department of Immigration has enormous numbers of requests and also enormous problems with transparency as well, probably associated with the volume of requests.
Thank you, Mr. Holman, and thank you, Ms. Balhus. We'll now go to Mr. Weiler. 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for joining us again today for one of our meetings. I want to pick up on some of the discussion on whistleblowing that's been underway here, and of course we have a criminal law prohibition against, or an offense rather, for employers that take action against employees for disclosing information to law enforcement. And I'm wondering, for all the witnesses, but maybe particularly Mr. Braun and Cutler, if you think that this should also be an offense for employers for taking action against employees that make disclosures to third parties like the media.
I do, yes. I think it should. The criminal bar is a little harder to reach if you're trying to prove, but definitely it should be an offense, I would think. Mr. Cutler?
Yes, I think the other thing which we haven't mentioned often enough is the need in the law to have the reverse onus, which basically says that if they try and retaliate, they have to prove they have not retaliated. It's the whistleblower needs protection from retaliation. And if you make the organization responsible for proving they did not do it, the whistleblowers will feel much safer coming forward. And that's not just criminal, because keep in mind, while we're talking COVID, we've also got environmental concerns. We've got a lot of concerns out there which are not just financial, and there's no protection.
If I could also add that criminal code provision has never been used. It's completely ineffective, and it's not surprising because it's just a law that says it's an offense. It doesn't say anything about protection. It doesn't say anything about a duty of the employer. It's basically hollow. It's just a line in the criminal code.
Well, thanks for that. And I know that it was brought up a little bit earlier by my colleague. The OSC has whistleblowing protection and incentives. The AMF, the same thing. And the SEC, was mentioned before, has pretty hefty incentives for whistleblowing. And I'm wondering if it's your opinion that this is kind of a requirement to having an effective whistleblowing program.
Ian, you've done more work on this than I have.
I'm sorry. Could you restate the question? I'm not sure I quite understood it.
Do you think it's necessary for there to be incentives for a whistleblowing program to be effective?
No, I don't think it's necessary. I think it's helpful in circumstances where there's large amounts of money involved, for example. But there's research out there that suggests that small incentives actually discourage whistleblowing. So it's not always appropriate. I think it's more about protection and valuing the employees who speak up in cases where, for example, there wouldn't be a huge payout, for example, in the financial sector.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Braun. And I think to many, whistleblowing does carry along with it a stigma. And people don't want to be considered a snitch or to be seen as working against your fellow employees or your team. And I think we all know that this kind of contributes to some of the challenges that we see today you mentioned with environmental violations as well. And I was wondering if you had some suggestions, maybe to all three witnesses, about what the federal government could do to maybe change the culture and the perception of whistleblowing.
Alan, do you want to go first?
Okay. I think the first thing you have to do is have the political levels acknowledge whistleblowers are of value and not an impediment to the process. Because as soon as something happens, and the senior bureaucrats are really good at this, by the way, we could give you examples. They spin the situation, it goes to the politicians immediately are saying it's the fault of so-and-so or blaming each other's parties. Phoenix, for example, was a bureaucratic bungalow, totally. But they've managed to get the two political parties fighting with each other over it. And it's totally a bureaucratic mess that they created themselves. Okay? So how do you correct that? You've got to have people who will say, come forward and we honor you coming forward. Maybe a special award for the whistleblower of the year in the federal service, honoring that individual, something that really highlights how important and how you value people.
Thank you, Mr. Cutler. And if either of the other witnesses have something they think they might add, if you would be happy to put that down in writing and send it to the committee clerk, it would be appreciated. Thank you, Mr. Weiler. We'll now go to Ms. Vignola for 2.5 minutes.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cutler, Mr. Braun, Mr. Holman, you all said at one point or another that people were afraid, they did not trust the commissioner, but they talked to you. Would one of the solutions be to make sure that there is an independent organ that would be responsible to hear them and do everything in their name while protecting their identity, both in the public and private sphere?
Well, I'll speak first and I won't go into details, but say that's exactly what the integrity commissioner is supposed to be. And please note I said supposed to. Ian, Sean?
Absolutely. That is indeed what the commissioner is supposed to do, keep confidentiality. Of course, there's nothing for the public, for the private sector right now at all. So adding that would be extremely helpful. Yeah, it's people need to see results. It's about not just having a system that works invisibly in the background. They need to know that it's going to be effective. And if they don't see that, they're not going to trust it.
Exactly. Yeah, and right now, in a lot of ways, the public service is trapped in a spiral of silence. People don't speak up because other people don't speak up. So the spiral of silence continues. And we get this secrecy in the federal government around wrongdoing that really should be everyone's business, including the public.
Okay, so if I can summarize, people don't trust the commissioner because they don't trust that the system will be efficient. Have I understood correctly?
Use the word efficient, but I would agree with your statement. Ian?
Yeah, I would agree. And yeah, it's just that the experience is, how many years has this law been in place? It's been in place for 14 years, 13 years, 14 now. And the number of cases that have been found to be founded and justified disclosures is so low that, you know, if you're a person who's working in the public service, you might validly ask, why bother?
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Braun. Appreciate that. We'll go to Mr. Green now for 2.5 minutes.
You know what? I'm actually satisfied today, fellas and ladies present. So I'm okay to wrap it up. We're at
thank
6,
you, Mr.
right?
Green.
We're at the end of the day here. Is that right?
Yep. We're just finishing up. We have two more questioners. So we'll go with Mr. Diot and then followed by Mr. Drouin. So Mr. Diot.
Yeah, well, thanks very much for the great testimony from the witnesses. It's really, really useful. And you folks are real pros in all of this. So I'll just say, give us all your one or two best points of, if we could wave a magic wand right now, what could we do to fix this situation so that the federal government is more transparent? And just a brief comment from each one of you, please.
So for me, from the whistleblowing perspective, I think we need to go back to the drawing board for the whistleblowing law, and we need to extend it to the private sector, and it needs to meet best practices. There are best practices out there at the EU, Government Accountability Project. You can copy model laws out of, say, Ireland, or as I was saying earlier, Serbia. Go back to the beginning and start from scratch.
Okay, I'll support what Ian's saying, go back to scratch. What I will state is, at least at the federal level, extend it out to every federal agency that's out there, which would really include a huge number. And it also, within the federal purview, could be extended to any firm with a federal contract, under the federal contract. That alone would cover so many people. Sean?
Yeah, and just to pick up on my colleague's points, I think we also need to legally mandate the release of broad categories of public records to get it out of the access to information system and simply put it in the public domain. And the other thing is, a lot of these changes shouldn't require enormous amounts of time. Everything that my colleagues have been talking about, and that I've been talking about, has been talked about many times before. We shouldn't need a protracted process to bring in these reforms. To Mr. Green's point earlier, we should just be able to do them. And there's enough information out there to know what best practice is and what best practice isn't.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. You really are doing a great service to the public, and keep up the good work. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Diot, and then we'll go to Mr. Duran if you have any further questions.
Yeah, just a few with regards to the ombudsperson that we've discussed. I think Mr. Braun, you brought this up, and I'm getting a sense that you and I've known from previous testimonies from the groups of threes that I call on transparency, but the Integrity Commissioner's office is simply not working out for the current whistleblowers, and I'm curious to find out how would the ombudsperson work differently than the Integrity Commissioner's office.
Well, for now, it would be more of an advisory role to help people coming forward. The classic ombudsman role is not necessarily to assign accountability. It's to help to resolve disputes and to get to the bottom of matters and facilitate the correction of problems. In order to have the kind of powers that the Integrity Commissioner has, you'd have to develop a law that would extend to both the public and the private sector.
Okay. Mr. Cutler, I'm curious to find out those who have come to you and disclosed some issues that they essentially disclosed issues that thought would be whistleblowing. I'm curious to find out, are you coaching them in terms of offering advice on how to document and gather evidence in order to sort of build that case so we can find the culprits within the system?
We always give them the advice, but I have to be clear, the decision of how to use that advice is theirs. We're always clear on that, because a lot of them will not go forward. We've had some clear cases where proof has been brought to us of wrongdoing, and I mean proof in our hands, but we can't go forward because it would expose the whistleblower, and we will never damage the person who is bringing us the wrongdoing. We won't take that risk.
Great. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Drouin. And with that, I would like to thank the witnesses, Mr. Braun, Mr. Cutler, and Mr. Holman, all three of you, for being with us today and bearing with us because of the votes that we had that delayed us a little bit. So we do appreciate you sticking with us for this length of time. I'd also like to thank the interpreters and technicians, as well as the analysts and the clerk, for bearing with us as we go through that. So with that said, and I see that my clock says 5:07, and I said we started at 3:08, which means we were 1 minute ahead of time. And thank you very much, everybody, for being with us. I call this meeting adjourned.
Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.